Sewing is a beautiful hobby. You're creating things from scratch, and it's very useful because you're making the most out of your wardrobe or your house. But sometimes it's a bit overwhelming because there's lots of little details we don't know, and sometimes we even waste fabric when learning. So here are 10 things you shouldn't miss, 10 things you must know before you start sewing. If you're a beginner, let me know down in the comments which one surprised you, and if you're not, if you've been sewing for a while, let me know which ones you skip. It's not an exam or anything, but it's fun to know. When you're going to start a sewing project, it's ideal to know how much fabric you're going to be needing, just because it's a waste of time to go a second time to the shop and maybe you even go and they don't have that fabric anymore, because sometimes things just fly. So just make sure how much fabric you're going to need. If you're working with a pattern, they always tell you how much is needed, but if you're just doing it yourself, your own pattern, just try to measure and maybe buy twice the height of your garment, or try measuring the width and calculating how much it's going to be. And the same with all the notions, all the threads, ribbons, elastic bands, zippers. Just try to make a list of everything you're going to need. And once you get home with your fabric or fabric haul, you need to wash and iron all these fabrics. At least wash them until you use them, and then you iron them just before cutting. But washing is really important because all these, if you have natural fabrics like cotton or linen, they're going to shrink in the washing machine. And there's nothing worse than spending a long time sewing, being really proud of something, of a garment, and then have it shrunk in the washing machine. That's just the worst thing ever. It happened to me once, and the dress was like a doll's dress. So just wash it, and then just before cutting, remember to iron it so your pattern goes flat and your lines and cuts are straight, because then if you don't, you'll have curved lines where you're supposed to be straight lines, and it'll be a mess. So everything washed and ironed. And once you're going to start your project, you have to be really careful about the grain. You need to be cutting your things on the grain. When you go to the shop and you see the rolls of fabric, they are the width. So this is the cross grain, and you need to cut it on the grain. So when you ask for a meter of fabric, a meter and a half, you are getting the grain, you are getting the length. And that's what you need to cut. And this is the selvage edge, the edge of the fabric. So here, for example, I only have like half a meter of fabric, even though I have all the width of the roll, which is always more or less 140, 160 centimeters, unless it's a double one, which will be 280 for upholstery materials, curtains, things like that. So when you place your fabric on your table, you need to be sure you're cutting on the grain. You can't really make the most of your fabric by placing your patterns diagonally on the bias and things like that, just for the sake of doing it, because it'll have a different texture to it, and it'll move, and it won't settle properly. So just be sure to cut on the grain. Now it's the time of cutting. You have your fabric, you have your pattern, and you're going to cut. Make sure you leave your seam allowance, because if not, it will be small, just small. So take into account that each seam will take at least half a centimeter to a centimeter from your garment. So that's going to shrink terribly if you don't leave it. So leave your seam allowance. Just make sure, if your pattern tells you you need to leave 1 centimeter seam allowance, or maybe if it's included, but just make sure. And depending on the fabric, you're going to need, depending on the texture of your fabric, you're going to need more seam allowance. So just make sure to leave some. Once we've cut our pattern, we're left with all these little scraps of fabric that are not really useful, but you can use them to try the different tensions and needles you're going to need. You don't really know until you go to the machine of the tension for this kind of fabric. If you put too much tension, maybe it gathers, or maybe if you don't, it's going to be too loose. So you're going to need to try, and the best way to try is with all these little scraps that are really rubbish. So use them, and then just keep them, don't throw them away, because they can be useful for filling in cushions. Sewing, like any other hobby that involves working with your hands, any crafts like embroidering or cross-stitching, is very hard on your eyesight. So you really need to take into account the light you're going to be sewing with. It's not just enough to sew with the sewing machine bulb. That's just that's nothing. That's nothing. So just take into account the lighting you're going to be using, and have a little lamp or something besides you that helps you see better. In my case, I can make these lights brighter or dimmer depending on what I'm doing, so it's quite useful. And of course, I have another light I can use as well, another little side lamp, which is ideal if you're sewing difficult stuff like black on black. If you're sewing black thread on a black something fabric, it's the worst. Leave you cross-eyed. And when you start sewing, wait, come and see. When you start sewing, the machine is not going to make a knot for you, so your seam is not secure at all unless you use the reverse lever. This what does is that it makes a stitch backwards, so you can make sure that your seam is not going to open. If not, if you don't do that, it will, and it won't. It will open, it will break, you'll end up with nothing. So just make sure you used it to make your seams secure. And when sewing, one thing we all do is pull from our fabric, and that is terrible because you are forcing the machine. Maybe the stitches can even break, and your seam won't be as even. And if we're talking about stretchy materials or knits, that's going to be the worst because they're going to stretch more. So just feed your machine at its own rhythm and don't force it, so you have nicer seams and nicer results. It's really important to press your seams open once you've done them, so they settle nicely and you don't have any problems when sewing the next seam on top. So just leave it by hand, and you can do it different ways. You don't need to sew, press all the time, because that means you have to leave your iron on, or you have to plug it and unplug it all the time. You can make it a bit more efficiently by sewing a few panels that aren't together and then pressing them, so you save some energy as well and some time. So just leave it by hand and do it, because you'll notice the results. One thing I think we don't say enough is that we have to clean the machine. The machine, take into account that all this sewing is pushing little threads. and that becomes lint in the mechanism. So there are three different ways of, not different ways of cleaning it, but there are three different phases. The quickest one is the bobbin area. That's where everything goes. So it's really easy to take out your bobbin and the mechanism down here and clean it with a little brush. Then every once in a while you should take this off to also oil it. It's really important to oil your machine because it will work better. And one thing I only knew a few months ago that needs to be done is to get rid of the plate, not get rid of it, but unscrew the plate on your sewing machine and clean under here. You won't believe the amount of lint that goes in there. It's amazing, it's unbelievable, and if you sew quite often it will get really messy. So just clean your machine, you will notice. So let's recap. Which things did you find useful or you didn't know about if you're a beginner, and which things you are skipping if you're not a beginner? So let me know down in the comments. It's really interesting, it's really fun to read what people usually do or what tips they have. And don't forget to subscribe if you're new around here, because I upload twice a week and that way you don't miss anything. And I leave you a link to all the talking videos I have. They're really interesting and I'm sure you'll find something you like. And I'll see you around. Bye!